I'm Ayelet Waldman.
I'm Paul Waldman.
This is Boundary Issues.
Welcome to Boundary Issues, the podcast where two siblings solve all the world's problems while blaming each other for their own. Today we are going to talk about polls.
Don't I even get to say hello? Hello, it's me too. It's Ayelet.
We are joined today by Ayelet, as always. So we're going to talk about polls today, and chances are when your phone rings and the caller ID says that it's someone from Amalgamated Research or whatever, what do? You probably just hang up and don't take that call, because who wants to stay on the phone for 20 minutes answering some stupid poll questions? You're not going to bother with that. And yet, so many of us are consumed with the polls that we see every day, and there are more and more and more of them. And there is this particular phenomenon that our guest today, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, refers to as mad poll disease. But I experienced this not long ago when the New York Times Sienna poll comes out. Often in recent days, it has shown slightly more favorable numbers for Republicans at times. And when that happens, I inevitably get a number of texts from friends and family saying, "Oh my God, is this right? Is everything going to hell?" That happened the last time the Times put out one of these polls.
By
And
friends and
the text I
family,
got was from Ayelet herself.
he just means me. He just means me. Like,
That is
who
true.
else? Who else is calling you frantically, hysterically? Me. I'm the one.
But the truth is that the reason that the Times Sienna poll gets so much attention has to do with media incentives. Every news organization that does their own polls wants to promote them as much as possible. And they also have an incentive to characterize them as dramatic and new. Remember, new is the basis of news. And so they will naturally try to frame the results in a way that makes you feel like something has changed, or something should be inspiring you to be afraid or excited or whatever, even if what they're showing is basically the same thing that they've been showing all along, or that other polls have been showing. But we're going to kind of unpack this as it relates to the presidential race and how people should think about this onslaught of polls. And we have a terrific guest today. Michael Podhorzer is the former political director of the AFL-CIO. He has founded a number of different political organizations. He is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and he writes a terrific Substack called Weekend Reading, which you can find at weekendreading.net, that has all kinds of interesting analysis about polls and all kinds of other things. And I really think he's one of the smartest analysts out there when it comes to understanding what's going on in the presidential race. What are the sort of underlying forces that are driving what we're seeing now and what we're likely to see come election day? So, Michael, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you. And that's really appreciate such a generous introduction. Thank you.
So maybe we could start just by sort of putting this in the context of what we're seeing right now. If you look at the various averages of polls that are out there, and there are a number of them, it looks like Kamala Harris is leading Donald Trump by around 2 to 3 points, depending on which one you want to look at. On the other hand, for instance, the Pew Research Center, which is one of the best polling organizations there is, they recently released a poll with a sample size of 10,000 that showed the race tied.
Oh
So
my God.
what? So what should we take from what we're seeing right now, and what should we not take from it that people sometimes take from it?
So I think if you're asking about the horse race number, the answer is essentially nothing. And you should, save on whatever you're using to medicate yourself after you read all these stories. I mean, especially beginning in 2016, our politics are really stuck on the 50-yard line. And people have made up, almost everybody has made up their mind on the fundamental question, right? This is going to be the fifth consecutive election about Trump or MAGA, right? That's never happened in American history. And in each of those elections, two things have been true. one, the polls have shown each of those elections to be very volatile. And two, the results haven't been volatile at all, right? If you think even about that Pew study, which had it even, that would have meant that the swing from Biden to 2024 was 4.5 points, 6.5 for the New York Times poll. In the 21st century, other than the first Obama election, no swing has been that large. But we condition ourselves to think that big change could happen right away in between elections because polls are inherently volatile. And if
Wait,
you
what?
think,
Can I stop you for a second? Why? Why are polls inherently volatile? Why are they so inaccurate? Why do they swing so wildly?
you go back to what Paul said to begin this about whether you're going to answer your phone or not, right, or take a survey, is it has been a very long time since polling has really been anchored in the probabilistic models that gave birth to polling. And as response rates started going down and down and down, really smart, stats heads started trying to come up with ways to apply weights to each of the interviews in order to compensate for that not being representative, right? And like at a very simple level, what they're kind of doing, oh, we didn't get enough white non-college people in this poll, so we'll just give each of their interviews a little bit more weight so that
Wait,
it
wait,
ends up.
wait, wait. What are you saying? They literally weight different people's responses
Yeah,
differently?
that's the only way they can make it even come close,
And
right?
maybe I
That's
could give a little bit of
So
context here, just so
how is
people
that a
understand.
poll?
Well, let's step back a little bit and talk about how this is supposed to work. So the idea is that you, in a perfect world, you have what people have heard of as a random sample, meaning everybody in the population has an equal chance of being asked to participate in this poll, and you get 1,000 people or 1,500 people or whatever, and that gives you a good approximation of the population at large. But as Mike said, over time, response rates went down and down and down. And pollsters are realizing that it's not just that they're having more trouble getting people to answer the polls, but that certain people are even less likely than others. So, for instance, for a long time, it was hard to get young people to answer a poll. It may have been harder to get black people. And so, what do you do if you took this 1,000-person sample and you realize, well, we know roughly, with pretty good accuracy because of the census, how many people there are under the age of 30, but yet we don't have enough of them in our poll. Well, what you can do is you can make some little statistical adjustments to the ones that you do have to kind of make your sample look like the population at large. And so that's called weighting. And it's not like this person just counts for two or three. It's done for every question and in really kind of statistically complicated ways. And then there's another big change that happened too that I think a lot of people may not understand, is that even though you're still getting those phone calls, the best polls now are not done over the phone. A lot of them are using what's called panels, where they recruit many thousands of people and they pay them. They say, if you want to we'll pay you $100 or whatever it is. So for a year, we're going to periodically ask you to go on your computer and fill out a poll. And then they have this big sample of many thousands. And then out of that, they will randomly pluck 1,000 people to do a poll. They'll fill it out online. And then that's what the poll that you have will be reported on the basis of.
So I don't understand how that isn't completely polluted by the bias of the people constructing the poll. So that's one question for you. And I don't understand how, so because they're making an assumption about who's picking up the phone, and they're making an assumption about the representation of that one the individuals who they're weighting more. They're making an assumption. It feels to me like that is all about human decision making, but this mythology of a poll is that it's a statistically neutral thing that I'm reading. So that when I read a poll, my assumption is, okay, this isn't that it isn't about human error, and there's no human error, and there's no inherent subject. It's a decision making, and that you're telling me now that's just all bullshit, Mike.
Yes, that's like literally my point, right? you just like that is what I cannot understand why like any person with any common sense doesn't understand. If you think about things that we know have actual statistical probabilities like flipping a coin or rolling two dice, right?
Hmm.
If you want to know what the probability of rolling snake eyes is, you're not going to get a different answer from Republican and Democratic pollsters,
Right.
right? That is what you think we're saying you thought polling was. But that's not what's going on, right? And that's why, like, if you step back, why there are so many polls out there and they don't really agree with each other, right? At all, because they're all making different assumptions. And I like to say that it's real, like reporting on polling that way is, to use words you too, opinion journalism. The opinions aren't ideological. It's like I don't think the media people doing this are saying, well, I want it to come out this way. They're making their best judgments, but those are just opinions. There's no right answer here.
And yet that's we read about it all the time. The New York Times made it sound like that shift that they put out was like a sign of disaster for the Trump. So for Kamala Harris. So tell me what's going on in those campaign offices. Within those campaigns, are Kamala's people saying, "Okay, the polls are shifting. Great." Are Trump's people saying, "This is all bullshit"? I mean, what, or they all know that it is all bullshit. And then why do we have this kind of notion, this secret idea that the internal polling is somehow more magical? Like what's the difference internal, external? And do they care? And if they care, why do they care?
All right. So they do care, but not for the reason that you're suggesting about what it says about their campaign, right? At the AFL-CIO, and in, like people who do this, like at the presidential level or the high level, like we were talking about 1,000 person survey. In a cycle, we have more than 1 million interviews and are not using them to just really to find a horse race number that's so clickable in the media, but to get understand how the things that are going to determine who wins are being processed by the population, right? So if you were the Harris campaign, instead of obsessing on the horse race, you'd be looking at questions like how dangerous people think it would be if Trump got a second term, right? Are more people beginning to understand what the stakes of the election are, right? Which is not what the media really covers or a horse race kind of number or one that's susceptible for reasons that are kind of complicated to the same kind of problems we were just talking about. But where it has become a problem for the campaigns, and sometimes like the opposite of a problem, is that it really influences their online fundraising, right? Because it either, makes people depressed and don't want to give, or, right. And so they do worry about what the public perceptions that are being created by these polls that they can't control. But believe me, Jen O'Malley Dillon is not looking at the Sienna poll and making decisions on the basis of it.
And the other thing is that it's in the interest of news organizations to impose some kind of a narrative on whatever their poll tells you, right? So they want to say that this is meaningful, and we're going to explain to you why this happened. Like, let's say there's a shift in the last time we took our poll, and between then and now, of 2 points toward Kamala Harris. Now, that could be just purely a statistical artifact. But when they write the story, journalists are going to want to say, well, here's why it happened, and I can explain it to you. And then they'll pick out events that occurred between those 2 points in time, and they'll say, well, it was probably because people were understanding what that thing happened in the debate, and then there was this little micro controversy, and that moved things this way. And they're just pulling that out of their ass, basically. If there's no direct reason why that is the right explanation for what happened. It could be meaningful. That change could be real, or it could be just kind of a blip up and down. But they're going to try to impose some kind of an order on it to tell you why they think that happened.
I call that narrating the noise. Like they like get these. inevitably different results from poll to poll, and then try to figure out what the best way to explain something that's probably just noise is going on.
So here's my question about that. And we hear about so much that in this area and other areas, this notion. I mean, Paul, you and I know journalists. They're smart people. They're not, unless they're at Fox or at Newsmax, they're not malevolent actors. So, what is the impetus to do what surely they know is bullshit? I mean, these are political writers. Why? I mean, is it just like, okay, I'm gonna write this piece. I know it's horseshit, but I'm just gonna write. I mean, that what is happening in the mind of a journalist who is doing a story? I it's so hard for me to believe that they're either as stupid or evil as it sounds.
I think that part of the story is that saying that this thing happened, but it really doesn't mean anything is not something that editors will let you write. And I have had that experience where I've pitched stories that were like, okay, everyone's talking about this thing, but it really means nothing. And the response is, well, we're not going to do that. You have to tell us what it means. We're not going to, nobody wants to read that it doesn't mean anything. So there's that kind of incentive. And also, I mean, let's be honest, reporters and opinion writers like me, we are on a treadmill. Like, we have got to produce stuff every day. And a new poll is just like a good thing to talk about. And that's what you're going to talk about. You're going to try to impose some kind of an order on it, come up with some kind of an explanation for why it's showing what it's showing. And, it can be, your explanation can be perfectly plausible sounding to you. And that is often good enough.
So
So my
if I can, I really want to jump in right
oh
there
yes, please do.
because I think it's really important because I think the challenge is not the reporters, but the publishers essentially. That churning these surveys is the really high click and it's easy to monetize given the cost of doing it. It's really easy. And I think while there are other things that it's more debatable what it does to society, I think this is a really damaging decision that the publishers are making here and what they platform and what they put on the front page because our future depends on what they tell us are facts in our world, right? And our children and grandchildren, if they inherit a world that's made by Trump and MAGA, will be more interested in knowing if we knew that's what was coming or whether on September 18th we knew who was going to win the election, right? The job of the media, the thing that warrants the First Amendment, is making sure as citizens we're casting our most informed vote.
I read the New York Times. The New York Times is the paper of record. It's the one I read all the time. Why have I seen zero acknowledgement of culpability for the fact that in the run up to the 2016 election, we all know they published a butthurt emails piece every 35 seconds, and there seems to be no acknowledgement of their responsibility in that. And then they're doing the same shit with Kamala. Just recently, they have been drilling on this. She's avoiding the media. She does a huge organization of Black journalists media interview. They don't cover it. It's like it didn't happen. Instead, we're going to talk about JD Vance and cats and why tell me
I
why.
think Paul's better situated to answer that than I am. I just see it as their businesses, and bottom line is sort of stronger, like doing polling stores. And part of it is, going back to the Oracle of Delphi, like people are just, especially when so much is at stake, are understandably so anxious about how it's all going to come out. And so if someone's offering the idea that we can know, like everybody clicks,
Right.
right?
Right.
Yeah,
And
and it imposes an artificial precision on things,
yeah,
and that's why I think that some people like Nate Silver have turned from just talking about a number that says Kamala's ahead by 3 points to this new odds ratio where it says, oh well, now I've run 10,000 simulations and Harris has a 59% chance of winning as of today, and that is that's particularly ridiculous, but it makes you as a reader feel like, oh, well, now I have some grasp on some fundamental truth. I know what is going to happen. And that, you're in this state of uncertainty that both draws you to the news and is very unsettling. And so they're saying, well, here we can kind of resolve this uncertainty for you. We can tell you exactly what it is. It's a 59% chance, not a 58 or a 60%
Right.
chance.
Right. And because people, like almost everyone is wired to believe that a number is true in a
Mm-hmm.
way they don't
Right.
believe a sentence is.
Right.
Right. And so if you think about, say, the Cook report, right, which classifies races as toss up, lean one way or the other, or likely the other, that's all Nate Silver's doing too, except that he's putting a number on it. Right.
Right. Which
And
inherently feels scientific.
right, and makes you think that. I do want to relate. He just wrote, Nate Silver just wrote this book that what really had a amazingly revealing section about the 2016 race, where he said that Clinton had a 71% chance of winning. And this really illustrates what's going on here, because a lot of people were very upset at him because Trump won, and felt they'd been misled and all of those kind of things. And but the first answer he gave at the time, which is true, and ought to have been just disqualifying to ever listen to a forecaster again, which is to say, yeah, but there was a 29% chance Trump would win. 29% happens. Well, if that's the case, why bother, right? But the thing he said in his book is that he was also congratulated by a lot of people and even taken out to dinner. And the people that did that were the people who saw him saying 71% chance and the prediction market saying 80 or 90% and made a killing, right? Because that's actually what's going on here is it's about coming up with the odds of your being right about it rather than the odds of the thing itself. And it's fine if the application is a baseball game or a basketball game or something like that, but not influencing people's decisions about the things that affect the election, right? So in 2016, in James Comey's memoir, he actually acknowledges that part of the reason he felt okay doing the letter the week before the election was because he was sure that Hillary was going to win, and it would have looked bad if it came out afterwards that he had held it off. There were like people were making decisions that mattered in the world because this stuff was out there.
I am the sort of quintessential model of the person who flips out every time they read something new. So there was that opinion piece by she seems to be a Republican. She's a pollster, but she seems to be a never Trumper. At least that was the tone of her piece. Kristen Soltis Anderson. Did you see that piece? And what
She
did you
does
think about?
a lot of them, so I'm not sure I know which one you're talking
So
about.
she was just basically saying, "Oh, you think you're feeling good, Kamala Harris supporters? Well, there's no reason for you to feel good. And I think that we shouldn't be confident that this is going to go the way you thought it was. And she might have fundraising momentum, but nothing happened after the debate. There were no changes. There's all these polling averages that show that there's no distinction and that he's holding a lead in the Sun Belt states, blah, 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 blah."
Yeah, and I think that any election that's going to be really close, we should understand is by definition unknowable because it depends on what happens between now and then, right? And that's another part of what's really dangerous about these forecasts is that implicitly it tells you that what you do as a citizen doesn't matter because there's a knowable outcome, right? And so, like when you're thinking, instead of thinking, what's the margin of error on this poll? Am I really sunk, or is she really going to win? Understand that in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, it's going to come down to the margin of our effort, right? It's not going to come down like to obsessing on the margin of error.
So what has been shown to work? So for example, this weekend I did some phone calling in Pennsylvania. I had a long conversation, 15 minutes, with a Palestinian guy who said he could never vote for Kamala. And I actually know a lot about Palestine. I am, I've been a Palestinian rights advocate. We really talked for a long time. And my point with him was I could never tell you to support anybody from this administration after they have the way they facilitated the genocide. But I also know that it's going to be worse. I know that it's going to be worse. I know that Jared is measuring the drapes for, a Gaza resort. And I left that conversation thinking, well, maybe there'll be a moment when he's standing in the polling booth, or maybe there'll be a moment where he's looking at his ballot and he says, and maybe he budges. On the other hand, I had a bunch of these conversations which were, yeah, I'm going to vote, or a couple of those, but they were mostly, oh, like one of them, this guy said to me, no, I'm an undecided voter. I said, well, that's great. Let me tell you about Kamala. I happen to know a lot about her. I actually know Kamala, know her pretty well. Tell me what you're most like. What of her policies? What can I tell you more about? And he said, well, is she Indian or is she black? So obviously it's a Trump voter, which I decided, fuck you, I'm going to take you seriously. I said, well, that's a really interesting question because her mom is Indian. She's an immigrant from India, and her dad is black, which makes her biracial. And in America, very often, people who are biracial and black, they tend to identify as black because that's how people see them. For example, that might be how you see someone who's mixed race and black. But of course, that's only
Did
one
your
year.
condescending pedantry work?
You know what? It worked as well it was going to work because he's a dick and he's just going to be a Trump supporter.
I
So,
love
like,
this podcast. Yeah.
what? So, what, Mike? What does work? Like, you were at the AFL-CIO. This is something that I literally just said AFL-CIA, like in that movie. But you were at the AFL-CIO. A source of constant mystery to me is how any, I mean, look, Paul's book kind of answered this question for me. I'm sitting there thinking, why? How could a working person think that Trump is going to be better for them? It's so insane. It's so insane. I'm like, oh, they're just fucking racists. So, and
That's not what the book said, by the way. But
Yeah.
okay, they're
it's more
angry.
complicated than that.
They're full of rage. For whatever reason, they're full of rage. They're full of rage. So my question to you is maybe it's two different questions. One is, what does work? Does canvassing work? Does it make sense for me to go to Pennsylvania? I am actually, Paul, a really good canvasser. I don't come across
I'm
as
sure.
sanctimonious. I come across as open. I want to have a conversation. I listen really hard. So fuck you. But also, so my second question is, maybe if you could help me understand what is happening with the constituency, the labor constituency. So maybe let's take the first one, seems more related to what we're talking about, and then we'll go to the second one. So, like, what works? What, from your experience, from the history, from your analysis, actually moves the needle on in this period that
Yeah.
a citizen like me can do?
Right. In this period, where, as I said, this is the fifth time we're having essentially the same election. Very few people have changed their mind if they have voted before. There are very few people who, especially after 2020, that are like going like flip flopping on this, right? And most people, like the more someone's saying they're undecided, the very much less likely they are actually to even go out and vote.
Right.
And
probably all six of them are being interviewed by the New York Times as we speak.
exactly. But the really important thing that gets left out of the way politics voters are covered, and that really misdirects the whole conversation, is that voters can do three things. They can vote for Trump, they can vote for Harris, and those are things that are easy to create the impression that a poll can tell you what they're going to do, and are going to be, a poll will actually be kind of accurate in the sense that very few people who say they're going to vote for one will end up voting for the other. But the third choice is the one that actually will matter the most, which is whether you're actually going to vote, right? And so going into this election, there are about 72 million people who have voted in the last 4 elections. And those 72 million, almost all of them are going to vote again. And they're almost all going to vote for the same person they've been voting, the same side they've been voting for. That won't even be half of all the people who turn out, who actually end up
Oh no,
voting.
really?
And so you have another over 100 million people who have cast the ballot at least once in the last 4 elections. And so it's really sort of the ratio of the people who have voted for Biden or Democrats before, there are 91 million of them, to the number of those who voted for Trump. There are 83 million of them. And those are folks who are going to come out for one of two reasons, and it's not because of either of their policies. The thing about whether someone is going to vote or not is that it is almost never a rational decision in the way that voting for Harris or Trump might be. Although
Mm-hmm.
on this podcast, I'll say voting for Trump is not a rational decision.
No, it means you're a psychotic piece of shit. Go on.
Right? Whether you vote is a behavior. You have to actually do a thing, right? And so the part of your brain that's at play, the way what's going to make determine it is very different from rational argument. And the two things that matter the most, and it's not just in this moment, it's just basic behavioral psychology. The first is whether you feel like you have something big to lose in this election, right? People are loss averse, right? They're going to be much more likely to take an action to avoid injury than they are to get a reward. There's some, people who are not like that, but almost all of us are that way. There's just tons of scientific replication of that as being a basic behavioral trait. And the reason turnout's gone up so much, the reason that Democrats have been winning these elections is because of people now really believing that there'll be a national abortion ban.
Right. I was going to say, so now it's abortion, and that's what we've been saying all along. This
Or
is
some
our
other specific thing that, well, I'm going to lose my health care. I'm going to lose insulin, drugs, if that, right? That gets someone off the couch, right? Anyone who is not a regular voter is not going to be step one, I'm going to see who I really want. Step two, I'm actually going to go vote. So that's one thing that gets people out.
So why isn't every single ad why these like lovely fun loving ads, these like this is why isn't every single ad you will never get to have an abortion. They will pass a national heartbeat bill. There will never be abortion again in America unless you get off your ass and vote. And so why isn't every ad that?
A lot of
Because,
them are.
yeah, a lot of them are, but also, and this is where your work as a canvasser or phone banking, or more really in terms of just your interactions with people, we're in a period where if you're not a regular voter, you just think politicians are the worst. And you just expect them to talk trash to each other, right? So you need to not just hear that, like Trump will do a heartbeat bill. You need someone you trust to say, yeah, that's right, right? And so the ads only take you so far. It really needs sort of that civil society reinforcement. So that's one thing, is whether people feel they have something to lose in that way. The second thing, which is part of the sort of upbeat stuff, but it is, if you had done a survey, and this one I don't think we'd have to worry about the result, like the scientific stuff we were talking at the beginning, of which NFL teams had the biggest fan bases in the country, it would not be the Kansas City Chiefs and the San Francisco 49ers. Yet this last Super Bowl had more people watching than any Super Bowl in history. Why? Taylor Swift, right? So you had
Right.
people who didn't even know what the line of scrimmage was showing up for this thing because it was socially cool.
So do we feel now that like this Taylor Swift
I'm
is gonna
not. I'm
push?
not saying that the actual Taylor Swift in politics. I'm saying that if you're someone who might not vote, but if you voted, it would be against Trump. it matters whether your friends are saying, hey, have you voted? Hey, I just voted. It wasn't so hard. Hey, right. If it looks like being like it's called social proof. If it looks like people like you are voting, then it
Mm,
makes you much more likely to vote, right? And it makes you feel more included in your social circle. And those two things are why, like, by an order of magnitude more than, like, really in a historical extent, the number of people voting in 2018, 2020, and 22 just is off the charts.
interesting.
And I think that it is important to remember that this all exists within the kind of social milieus that people inhabit. It just occurs to me, I remember a conversation that I had back in 2016 with your daughter, Ayala, my niece, when she was then a student at a liberal Northeastern liberal arts college. And I asked, this was during the primaries, and I asked how many people there are supporting Hillary Clinton, or are they all for Bernie? And she said zero are supporting Hillary Clinton. It was everybody was
Right.
supporting Bernie Sanders
Right.
because it would have been terribly uncool to be
Right.
for
Right.
Right.
Hillary
Right.
Clinton in that primary if you were a college student. And,
Right.
that wasn't enough to get Sanders a nomination, but I'm sure that he kicked her ass among college students.
Yeah.
Right.
Um, and the thing you were talking about with your efforts to get people in Pennsylvania to vote for Harris, that relates to something that's called deep canvassing, I believe, where it's basically canvassing, but in a way that takes a lot of time, and you really get into deep conversations with people, and you ask them questions about themselves,
So,
and you
like what I
build up
did
this
with that
connection.
Palestinian
Yeah, and
guy.
and there and there's an analogy to labor organizing too. Labor
Right.
organizing is, as I'm sure Mike could tell us, it is really hard. But when it works, it's because people build up these connections that they have with people based on their shared interests in their workplaces that can eventually transcend differences of religion or race or things in ways that show people how their lives and the conditions of their economics are connected to what happens in politics. That it's not just that your boss is a jerk, but there's a system there that
Right.
enables your boss to be a jerk, and it takes a long time, and it's really difficult, and you have to talk to people again and again and again. But that shows how complicated it can be. It's much easier to just throw an ad up and put couple $1 million behind it, but that doesn't stick. That's the
Right.
problem.
Does the Democratic Party know this? Like, Mike, you surely have connections in this party. Do they know this? And do they have a plan of attack that is going to take advantage of or figure out how to deal with this notion that what works is this kind of deep canvassing that Paul was talking
More
about?
or less, yeah. I mean, this isn't like a secret. I think, and
Hmm.
that I think is one of the many sort of unquantifiable boosts that the switch from Biden to Harris has given the race, right? Because, like, think about, like, canvassing if you're, like, we're advocating Biden at this point,
Oh,
right?
God. Right.
Right. And you would have to deal with people legitimately being worried about whether he can do the job,
Hmm.
right? And their sort of resistance being something a reasonable person could believe, as
Right.
opposed to now where, like, you don't feel like you're going to get eye rolls when you knock on the door and say, I'm here to support Kamala Harris, right?
So, like, the thing that I could do, I'm just trying to think, like, what would be, I was trying to think, where's my micro niche? So, crazily enough, nowadays, I mean, my world is very, very progressive. The one place where I'm sort of bump up against people who don't completely agree with me is in my quilting circles. So, does it make sense for me to say, go to quilt shops and stand out in front of quilt shops and talk to old ladies as they walk in? Is that like, to like, if I could get my hands on, say, the mailing list for a quilting magazine? So I'm just talking about me as like an example.
Yeah,
Is
oh, no,
that the
no,
kind of
exactly. Yeah, that's great.
okay?
Right? No, that is like creating kind of a circle about it, right?
Is do you think quilting is like a no politics zone? Are people gonna will
Oh
people
no,
be
it is
No,
so
it's not.
it's not at all. Like
No, are you
there's
kidding
a
me?
dichotomy, but there's also like a big mushy middle. I mean, there's a lot of grandparents. There's a big Mormon quilting universe. But so Mike, let's talk a little bit about your the work that you were doing with the AFL-CIO. What happened to labor and if it's not like I'm obviously being very glib when I say a bunch of fucking racists, but there are plenty of not, there are lots and lots of workers who aren't white supremacists, right? So
Yeah.
what has happened in the labor universe? First of all, is my feeling right? The feeling that we're getting that labor tends, working class people tend to support Trump. Is that even right? And if so, what has happened to say the constituency, the massive constituency of the AFL-CIO that has made that shift possible?
Well, first, there's a big difference between working people who are in unions and ones who aren't, in terms of how they vote. For the last several cycles, union members have broken about 60-40 for Democrats. And depending on, like, different academics have tried to figure out sort of a comparable, and usually the difference when you control for all these things between how a union member votes and how someone who is different only in that they're not in a union, it's usually about 5 or 10 points better if they're in
Uh-huh.
a union. But part of the reason it's like just 60-40, even though like it's closer to even otherwise, is that remember that in almost every situation, you don't become a union member the way you become, say, a member of Move On, right? Where you have a viewpoint and say, okay, I want to join this thing with my viewpoint. People in unions are people like have a job where there's a union, right? So they start being just representative of the population who work in that industry, and
Mhm.
they start voting more progressively because they're in a union. And there have been a lot of studies, all of them show they also become less racist than if they weren't in a union, and all other good things, in part because unlike in the rest of the economy where everybody thinks it's a zero sum game, and if I can do, I want to do better than either this woman or a person of color or something like that. In a union, you are all subject to the same contract, and you all have a democratic participation in what that contract's going to be. And so, other than around the edges, you are conditioned to not want like a race advantage.
Is it in fact the case that there's more of an interest and less resistance to unions lately? And do you take heart from this kind of feeling, especially among young people, this sort of embrace of union culture that, or is that just another thing that the New York Times is telling me?
Even though the New York Times is telling you that, it's true.
Okay, good.
Right. I think it's even more significant than people have realized, because if you step back, the how much people support unions is one of those questions that Gallup has been asking for a long time, along with other institutions. And as we know, pretty much every institution in society is much less trusted, much less credible, less liked now than they were 20 years ago,
Right,
except unions
right.
that have become more so. And not only have they become more so as an institution when every other institution has become less so, part of that story is that Republicans have become more positive about it, right? And so unions are the only democratic inflected institution that Republicans are okay with, right? And I think a big part
Because
of
they think they can suck up those votes, because they think they can
no,
take
no,
it.
no, I'm talking no, 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 no. I'm saying that like average people.
Oh,
And
oh, okay, I get
right,
it.
I'm saying average people. And I think the signal that people aren't noticing is that working people feel really trashed by the way the economy's gone since the Great Recession, especially if you're a millennial or Gen Z, because And it's sometimes hard for people like our age to really appreciate that the kind of stability and idea of career and things like that that we grew up with are gone, right? Most people in that generation after the crash, everything got reorganized into gig work where you didn't know what your hours are necessarily or how much you're going to make for the year, and you've got to balance multiple jobs. And then you like compound that with COVID, where everybody gets fired and don't know what's sort of coming next. And I think that's the context for them seeing unions as a different kind of institution that is actually on their side.
Unfortunately, it has not yet translated into significantly higher union density for the country overall. And this is the thing that I think, as much as Democrats have relied on labor, Republicans at the elite level had a better understanding of all the things that unions do for individuals, whether it's in terms of economics and efficacy and political participation. The elite business class understood decades ago what a profound threat that was. And they undertook a very well financed, very well planned, and decades long campaign to destroy collective bargaining in America. It has been extremely successful. And we are where we're at now, where union density is, what is it, 8% or something?
It's about
Um,
10 overall, but 6 in the private
right.
sector.
Yeah. So we could do 4 or 5 episodes on that.
We
But
should, right?
maybe
We should.
since we're talking about polls, one of the things that has changed in the polls that it looked like for a while that the kind of anti MAGA majority that put Joe Biden in office was kind of dissipating and frittering away. But now it seems to, if we can believe what the polls are saying, that seems to have been sort of reassembled with Kamala
Right.
Harris. Do you think that that has happened? And what can you tell us about that and what it
I
portends
think
for the
it's
next
in
couple of months?
progress. I think it's in progress. I think one of the really important things that was sometimes hard to see, especially when Biden was in the race, is that when you kept seeing stories about Trump getting a bigger and bigger lead, it wasn't that he had become more popular. It was that Biden kept getting less popular. And but Trump has been basically at the same level of support for like 8 years. No, he's not getting more support. It's not like there were people who voted for Biden and said, "What was I thinking? I don't want the right to choose." And this is where sort of facile comparisons to the rise of right wing strongmen around the world breaks down. Because when Orban or Modi or Erdogan or Duterte won, they were in a similar kind of chaotic situation, but they were actually becoming more popular. And they weren't just winning because the other side was just getting more pathetic, right? They were winning because, at least for a little while, people bought what they were selling, right?
Mm.
But we haven't seen more people buying what Trump and MAGA are saying. We've seen a little bit less. And so on the anti-MAGA majority, the question comes back to what I was saying earlier about, do people believe that it will be as bad as the three of us know it's going to be if he gets back in office? And if they do, they're going to show up. He's going to lose.
All right. Well, that is a pretty good note to end
That's a
on.
great note to end on. And I'm going to call up my friend who's like this huge quilter with tens and hundreds of thousands of people, fans, and I'm going to make her do quilters for Kamala with me. And we're just going to get that shit off the
It's
ground right
it's
now.
even catchy. Quilters for Kamala.
But thank you so much. I really appreciate this conversation. I feel a sense of like I get the weight or actually the lack of weight of polls. And I feel like maybe I'm going to have more of a capacity not to feel whiplashed every 15 minutes. And
Yeah.
Paul is going to be super grateful to you because every day he gets another text from me like, "What the fuck are we going to do? Oh my god, oh my god." So this will alleviate some of the crap of his day. So thank you very much, Mike.
All right.
Thank you so much, Mike Podhorzer. This has been terrific.
Okay.
Take
Bye
care.
bye.
Bye bye.
Boundary Issues is produced and edited by Paul Waldman. Our music is by Zeke Shabon. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email us at waldmanpodcast@gmail.com. See you next time.